Hello and welcome to an episode of Arkin Webinar with me, Azrif. Now before I begin, allow me to clarify that this video is for educational purposes only and will only revolve around the event management industry as I am an event management student from UITM. Also note that this video will only feature research materials that are legitimate and news materials that are legitimate that I have came across the internet through my entire research when it comes to making this video in the first place. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about how events shape the economy. See, how events shape the economy. And we're going to look at the overview first, and then we're going to look at parameters, and then we'll move on to the entire content later on. So let's not waste any time. I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible and as layman as possible because I understand that economics is a relatively difficult subject to follow. So let's move on. So first things first. Overview. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the economy basically and how event management affects the economy. Why is it really important for us to note this? Because we have to understand that event management isn't just an industry, it's an ecosystem. It's a huge enough industry that can actually affect a nation's economy. And that is something to ponder about because not many businesses can actually reach to a level where you not only affect the economy on a national level, but on a global level as well. And that is something that is huge when it comes to event management or any sort of industry in this world. And then we're going to talk about when basically I'm going to show you when exactly do these things happen. We're going to get to that in a bit, and we're also going to look at uncertainties. Now this is something that I only want you to keep in mind because it's something that is given when it comes to event management, because uncertainties or risks as they're called, they're always there, and these are the kind of things that causes it to basically affect or impact an economy, and we're going to talk about that too. So let's move on to the parameter of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about two different things, right? Category of economy, basically type of event, and the type of event that we're going to talk about will only revolve around mega events, namely FIFA World Cup and Olympics. And this is really important because these are staple events that basically every single human being on earth would know about, and I thought it would make a great example on how event management can actually shape an economy. So we'll move to categories of economy that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about both microeconomy and macroeconomy, and this is actually important because to understand both of these things will lead us to understand why is it really important that we know it affects the economy. So let's move on to microeconomics first. So microeconomics basically concerns individuals and businesses, namely suppliers and contractors, workers, etc. These are part of the ecosystem. These businesses or stakeholders, if one may say, these stakeholders will exist in all mega events, meaning that in a mega event, if you've ever been to one, basically we're talking about FIFA World Cup, you're going to have vendors, you're going to have sellers, you're going to have people who sell merchandise, you're going to have people who set up the stage, you're going to have people who are working the fields, people who are working to produce the materials and the sports equipment relevant to the FIFA World Cup. And these are stakeholders and they're part of the ecosystem. And being all these things costs a lot of money. Doing all these things costs a lot of money. And what does that tell you? It tells you that there's work, there's job opportunities, money will be rolling on a macro level. But that is how it theoretically works. How it works in reality and based on the research is that it often causes a lot of losses because the aftermath is often less beneficial, and this is based on actual research. I'll leave a description in the video description below, so you'll get to look up this research if you have access to it. It's really good, and it really tells you how a mega event technically doesn't necessarily help people on a micro level, because on a micro level people also experience losses, and these often happen because of uncertainties, and these uncertainties could mean weather, could mean lack of tourism visits, could also mean competition. Because if you're going to a mega event and if you're selling something there as an average businessman, then you would expect millions of people to come to a mega event, especially if it's a FIFA World Cup. But in reality, a lot of people would also think like you, and it doesn't work that way. You don't get to sell everything because there's so many competitions, so many different uncertainties that will render your business completely useless or normal like anyone else, and it becomes a saturated market. And when that happens, and it often happens so much when it comes to mega events, oftentimes losses will incur, and that's a problem that we have to concede to. And basically on a very micro level, we can basically conclude that mega events are bad, generally because they affect the economy negatively on a micro level, because in the end there will be a surplus of things that you produce or try to sell, but you won't even try to sell them anyway, or you won't get to sell them, because in the end you have competition. There's just so many people within that ecosystem, and that's kind of harmful. And no matter how you try to control it as an event manager, it happens anyway. People will still sell it outside your event. People will still sell the kind of things or give sort of services outside of your control. And that is something that we also have to ponder about, because on a very micro level, mega events cause a lot of problems for stakeholders. And if we look at the macro level of things, when it concerns a larger scale of economy, mainly countries and the government, it's a problem as well, because mega events in itself cost a lot of money, as I mentioned before. And most countries bid on mega events based on these things: computer generated equilibrium, or CGE models, because it generates revenue expectations. So when it generates revenue expectation, countries are more likely to believe that they will gain more revenue than the cost of the event. So basically, they're looking for profit from that mega event, because they're thinking foreign direct investment, they're thinking tourist visits, and they're not wrong, because those things are completely plausible. But in reality, those kind of things only apply under certain circumstances, and we'll get to that later. And it's also based on a different research that I come across. Basically, the economic impacts had significant post-event decrease. The description for this research is also in the video description below, and it's bad because on a very macro level as well, there's no good in it, because people actually lose. There is a decrease in economic impact, and it's very tangible if you really look at the numbers. And we're just going to go into that. We're going to look at the numbers right now, because it's really important. So the reason why we need to look at the cost of mega events first, because we have to realize the gravity of the situation. So if we look at the cost of FIFA World Cup for South Africa, it was only about 4.3 billion, 15 billion for Brazil, and 14.2 billion for Russia. And these are the costs for mega events. And we're going to go through one by one, okay? So first we're going to go through how Russia did things recently. So Russia generated over 4 billion US dollars, and then they expect to realize the full impact of the event by 2023 with an increase of the GDP. And so far so good, because Russia is generally an established nation, pretty developed, so they have the necessary capacity to generate their income and increase their GDP and continue to flourish through FIFA World Cup. So they're expecting to actually exceed the amount here, 14 billion, and actually turn that into some profit. So without doubt, Russia might be able to do that because they are a developed nation. And the circumstance is that whether or not you are a developed nation. But when it comes to Brazil, it's a problem because the venues built in Brazil for FIFA World Cup are now abandoned. And don't you think that it's a huge loss when you spend billions and billions of US dollars to build huge venues, expensive venues with high upkeep, and just after FIFA World Cup, those venues become completely abandoned? And that's a waste of money. So where does all the money go? Hence, there's a reason why you can see how Brazil's economy doesn't necessarily flourish even in 2020. Because theoretically, a mega event is supposed to flourish or help flourish the economy. But it doesn't necessarily happen when it comes to developing nations. Now, as opposed to what happened to Russia, it's still ongoing. So there's not much to say about Russia. But based on the current track record, it looks good. But when it comes to South Africa basically used only 4.3 billion. And this is a different anomaly because they don't necessarily have any sort of losses. And it's possible because they only used existing venues and repaired them, and they only fixed it up. And it still gets used every once in a while, but it's near abandoned as well. So that's also still a waste of money. And they also evict low-income citizens, so a lot of people are affected on that level as well. Homeless people, they become completely homeless. So it's wrong as well. It's bad because generally they drive people out from the area, and then people don't get to live there anymore. On top of that, those areas eventually become underused or abandoned, and it becomes a huge loss. But to South Africa, because they were a developing nation and they were smart with their budget, they managed to have their economy slightly flourish after FIFA World Cup. And it's good because it erases the stigma that South Africa is incapable of doing things. But they are, and that's good. So it applies to a lot of different circumstances. But oftentimes, mega events have negative impacts. And the most recent negative impact that we're going to see is what happens to Japan. And the reason why it's in red is because it's Tokyo Olympics 2020. And the biggest gripe with this is that it has an estimated budget of 12.6 billion US dollars. Sure, it might not be as more as FIFA World Cup in Russia, but it's also supposed to be one of the biggest Olympics ever because it's 2020. But because of COVID-19, a huge uncertainty, hence the red color, a huge uncertainty in this event, it becomes cancelled or postponed to 2022. And that's a problem because you've already used the money. So what happens then? What happens when a country uses money, especially in that sort of amount, 12.6 billion, and you don't get to run the event? You lose a lot. And that puts a dent in your economy. And when it puts a dent in your economy, it's going to cause other industries to have dents as well. And this is a problem that we have to understand. Hence, we really have to understand that mega events is a problem. So what's the conclusion here? Conclusion is basically mega events are bad for the economy. There are too many uncertainties with significant impacts. And only developed nations should host mega events. And this is something that we, as future event managers, should understand because we have to understand the capacity of a nation. So, in all honesty, it's a hard thing to follow. But it is something that we have to think about because one fine day we might be handling a mega event, and this is the kind of thing that we might have to go through. So think about that.